right, we're going to start. Thank you for coming to DIIS today or for joining us online. The event is also being showed online, livecast. So for our seminar on the role of photojournalism in documenting armed conflict in Central America, our speaker today is photographer and author, Robert Nickelsberg. In his talk, Robert will present his new book, Legacy of Lies, El Salvador, 1981 to 84. It's a book that contains mainly previously unpublished black and white images from El Salvador's brutal civil war. And Robert will also discuss the impact of US foreign policies during this period and trace its continuous effects today. My name is Marie. I'm an anthropologist and senior researcher here at DIIS, and specializing in Latin America, in the Latin American region, and Brazil in particular. And it's quite rare that we are able to welcome photojournalists here at DIIS. So I'm very pleased to be hosting this seminar today and have photos at the center of our conversation for us to learn about the past and reflect upon the present and the work of documenting armed conflict. So during the 12 years of El Salvador's lethal civil war, approximately, around 75,000 civilians were killed, and the peace agreement was signed in 1992. And Robert's book portrays the lived experiences of armed conflict, its victims and its perpetrators, both dramatic moments of war, but also the everyday life that existed amidst the war, as well as people's attempt to escape the war and flee El Salvador. So the powerful photos in the book are supplemented by essays, also by renowned journalists. And here I am showing one of the quotes in one of the book reviews by Bill Gentile, where he writes that it is not a book for the light-hearted. And I think that speaks very much to one of the issues I think we'll be exploring today about how to visually document armed conflict and its brutalities. So first, Robert will introduce his book and talk about the social and political environment in El Salvador at the time when he was there. And then after the talk, he'll be in conversation with Fins Debutate about the context of the photos, the role of photojournalism during armed conflict, and the continuous impact of US foreign policy on violence and migration in the region. So during their conversation, you'll have time to think about your questions. And then, so after their conversation, we'll open up for a dialogue with all of you. And then after the Q&A, you're welcome to serve yourself another cup of coffee or tea. I think we're already running out of chocolate. Maybe we can do something about that. But then there'll also be the opportunity to buy the book if you would like to. So just to briefly introduce our speaker, Robert was based in El Salvador and other Central American countries as a photojournalist between 81 and 84. He was a Time magazine contract photographer for nearly 30 years, specializing in political and cultural change. And after working in Central America, he was transferred to Brazil, where Brazil was just coming out of the 21 years of military rule at the time. And here, Robert documented the gold rush in the Amazon region in the state of Pará. And I highly recommend visiting his website and also taking a look at those at this photo series. There are a lot of really interesting photo series on that on your website, Robert. But that is something really. These photos are quite iconic, I think, at this point. And in the late 80s, Robert traveled to Afghanistan and documented the armed conflict there. And he's also the author of Afghan, A Distant War, and Afghan's Heritage, Restoring Spirit and Stone. And Fins Debutate is an emeritus researcher here at DIIS. Since the 1980s, Fin has worked and published on armed conflict, forced migration, post-conflict interventions, state building, violence, and the politics of dead bodies. And he's been working both in Guatemala, Peru, Afghanistan, and Somalia. So with this very brief introduction, I will hand over the floor to you, Robert. Thank you so much for coming all the way.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you, Marie and Finn, for hosting me this afternoon. Welcome. I will be putting out a lot of different details and information regarding not only photography, but my experience living in a country under conflict, how I navigated, and you'll see through the images in an analog period, this was not digital, how over a period of years I sent film north to my editors in New York unprocessed. So I never saw these pictures. I put them in envelopes, went down to the airport, shipped them north to an editor who then would tell me in 3 or fewer words, everything's fine, and that would be it. And I would occasionally go to New York for R&R to restore my batteries and look at the pictures that at that point in time I could barely recognize. So I would fly back to Miami, and from Miami it was a 3-hour flight to El Salvador. At that time, we had a very right-wing government with Ronald Reagan and his hawkish Cold War veterans of Alexander Haig, senators in Capitol Hill who were very strong anti-communists, and people wanted to stop the flow of communism from Managua, where you had in 1979 a revolution that threw out the Somoza family. And what really impressed me at that time studying Latin America was that both Somozas, father and son, had been graduates of West Point. And they were thoroughly indoctrinated in the American way of this bipolar world, certainly in the Cold War period. They were impressed the way America flexed its muscles, but as a student, we were also impressed with the anti-war movement. Anti-Vietnam War movement was very important for us, as well as the domestic civil rights movement going on at the time. So there was a lot of protesting at that period in the 70s, very similar now to the Gaza Palestinian situation that students are protesting about. So you can, in fact, duplicate that kind of emotional involvement of students and political involvement in resistance. So what I noticed was the recurring theme of the number of bodies that were being found on a daily basis becoming part of the headlines in El Salvador. And this drew me to think about what is causing this, and that I could get on a flight in 3 hours or less, be in San Salvador. And I decided to move there, took an apartment with the Time magazine correspondent. So we collaborated on the story. He was primarily involved with interviews, and I went to the field every day. The field also meant downtown. It also meant understanding a country the size, for me, of Massachusetts, very small. But also you needed to understand the geography, this being the Pacific. Nicaragua was here, Honduras is here. This border was very long, very porous. And at the same time that the violence was occurring in El Salvador, Guatemala was also experiencing a civil war. I visited both countries clandestinely on my first trip. To El Salvador, I came across through one of the main refugee camps of Salvadorans in Honduras. That was the entry point for journalists as well as for fighters, taking refuge right across the border, the Sumpul River. And I did a clandestine trip through Mexico to Guatemala City, with the Guatemalan Workers' Party. Finn, I think you know the PGT. I mean, a lot of acronyms back in that period still. So I was fully aware of what the opposition was up to, and that allowed me to work differently in the country, because to meet the guerrillas on a regular basis meant you had to deal with these fellows. All of these men in uniform are graduates of School of the Americas, which at that time had been in Panama and is now in Fort Bragg in South Carolina. Here you have some of the leaders of the main security death squads, which were running rampant at that time. And one thing that should be noted of these four gentlemen are the rings they're wearing. These are rings of the military academy. It's very similar to what the military did in the United States. If you were a graduate of the West Point, you wore a ring, and they were called ring tappers. If they wanted to get their view across at a meeting and they thought they might be outnumbered, they would start tapping their rings. This is a tradition. I'm not quite sure if it's still alive today, but the fact that they're all wearing them, they're all from different classes, graduating classes, but they held together and they stayed in business together, and they combined to form a group against the oligarchy in this country. The oligarchy needed them. The oligarchy controlled coffee, sugar, and cotton. Those were the three main exports. And these people, with their uniforms and the death squads at night, would enforce the harsh anti-communist doctrine. If you were a union organizer, if you were a critic at a university, if you were a doctor that appealed to the poor to come for free medical assistance, you were considered a critic of the government, and you were targeted. If you were picked up, your name was on a list, your life expectancy was about an hour. Nicholas Carranza was a colonel. He was responsible for the most serious death squad and eventually took exile in the United States, where he died. But he was also found to be on the CIA payroll, which we didn't know at the time, at $60,000 a year. Lopez Nuila was head of the National Police, also notorious death squad officer. This fellow needs a new tailor, but when he was a captain, he was also involved in El Mozote massacre of 1,000 civilians in the northeast part of the country. Up here, El Mozote, some of you may have heard of it. 1981 in December, by a U.S.-trained battalion commander, Domingo Monterosa. I'm going to refer to the map just so you can get an idea of where the countries are situated, and particularly Nicaragua, where the United States was very concerned that weapons would be coming in from Nicaragua. That was partially true, but it was also partially true that a lot of weapons were being sold outside the back door of a garrison by military officers. And stolen if they took over a militia headquarters or in battle. Here you have Nicholas Carranza at a U.S. Embassy ceremony that I attended. And remember, I was a registered foreign correspondent in El Salvador. I remained on good terms with all the embassies, with all the officials, in order to be able to go to ceremonies like this. Otherwise, you would not get access. But you can see he's appealing to a lieutenant colonel who is also the military attaché at the U.S. Embassy. He's appealing to him for something. And he's not buying it. We all knew who Nicholas Carranza was. He was very slick, very professional in his procedures, in his discipline, but he was a ruthless killer. And what was important for me was to get in on certain situations, social or military or political, work quickly, gather this sort of decisive moment, and leave. But I never burned my bridges. It was important to get into ceremonies like this because I lived there. I needed to have access on a daily basis. And foreign policy at that time was still very much stop the communism from coming north to the Mexican-Texas border. We're going to stop them. And that meant dead bodies. And every morning, twice a week, 3 times a week, that our housekeeper came to our apartment, a Salvadoran woman, we would ask her what she saw on the way to 2 of her bus stops to get to us. And if she saw dead bodies, which is often where the death squads left the bodies, we'd go there, look for them. It was our only proof that these killings were going on. Yes, getting into firefights is one thing, but the dead bodies was the result of harsh policies of stopping communism. They knew it was going on, the U.S. and other foreign dignitaries, but he was implementing the policy as head of one of the most serious security networks. "45 minutes from the capital, here's the capital, San Salvador, is La Libertad, the Pacific Ocean. Once or twice a month, I would go down on a Sunday for a cold beer and some fried fish, just to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city, as would Salvadorans. Salvador has very good waves for surfing, but you can see it's hard to imagine that a civil war is going on at this time on a Sunday. But wherever we went as journalists, whether it was to the beach or to the mountains, we also went to the morgue. You had to check out the morgue. And this is less than a mile from here. This is what you would see, evidence of the death squad. And there's sort of a warning here that you're going to see violence and evidence of violence, but the fact that it's in black and white makes it a little bit more palatable. But at this particular moment, and I stared at this picture long enough to imagine his reaction is that he recognizes who this person is. The facial features, his expression versus his expression, they're not related physically. But this awareness, when you half close your eyes and start looking at the floor and just wonder why this person didn't come home at night, it occurred to me that they're related. And that's why if somebody did not come home, that's what you did. You went to the morgue. You didn't go to the police station because you didn't trust the police. The police were involved in the killing, more than likely. So this is an open door. You did not need any special permission to go there, but you also knew how to be polite and dignified, allow people their space to grieve. If you were going to talk to them, you waited till they left. But these particular moments were very important for us to send north as evidence of what a civil war and a conflict was all about. And the idea to minimize the body, rather than make the body, as a photographer, the central point, the victim is more important. At the time, 1981 to 84, while I was there were 55 U.S. military trainers permitted under law to be in El Salvador at any one time. And this is a veteran of the Vietnam War. And as a 32, 33, 34-year-old photographer, when I was in university, the biggest fear was to be drafted into the Vietnam War, and that was what we did. To stay out of the war, you stayed in school. But whenever I see these boots, it's immediate to me that this is the Vietnam War period. Whenever I see this uniform, I knew immediately that this was a Vietnam War veteran. And the fact that he's a trainer indicates to me, and it's probably fact, that he was Special Forces, meaning a killer from Vietnam War. He is training a new battalion of Salvadoran soldiers. Everything here in this picture provided by the United States government, the M16, the uniforms, the hats, the boots, and the training with the Marlboro, U.S. You'll notice these cargo pockets. I could, with one eye open, I knew this was a Vietnam profile. Now, again, the ring comes up. This is a Colonel Sigfredo Ochoa, and part of the responsibility of the Salvadoran military was to promote hearts and minds programs in the villages, similar to the programs they tried in the Vietnam War, the Phoenix program. Isolate the villages, keep the guerrillas from coming in, keep the people hopefully from going up to the mountains and joining the guerrilla movement. This is a U.S. issued flashlight. These uniforms are paid for. He is also a graduate of School of the Americas, and he's a known killer, Ochoa. There was a case against him for being responsible for the death of over 130 civilians a year before this picture was taken. Now, look at the faces. They're not very enthusiastic, but he is trying to convince them to stay in the city. Don't join the guerrillas. We will fix your schools. We will fix your roads. We will give you better irrigation. We will fix your roofs. We'll bring doctors and priests back to your village. People are not fully believing it. And right behind him is this, a U.S. advisor. Again, this rolled up uniform. See this? I couldn't believe I was seeing this. Normally, they did not come out if the media were known to be at an event. But the arrogance of this fellow, also Special Forces from Vietnam War, there's one thing here that you may not quickly pick up on. It's this Israeli Galil machine gun. Now, the Galils were offered to the Guatemalan army. The fact that he is a Special Forces veteran and a U.S. military advisor allowed him to pick a weapon, but normally they did not pick the Israeli weapon. This I could not believe, seeing it. And you can see the expressions on their faces, not being able to believe they are in the presence of somebody like this. He's Dominican, so Spanish speaking. We were not permitted to take pictures of their faces, so you had to learn how to work from behind, and why I took the picture from behind here. There could be no names in the pictures if they had names on their chest. So this is an acceptable picture for us, although I did take their faces, just we couldn't publish it for Time magazine. And remember, I'm sending all of my film north unprocessed, so I never got to see it. Here we go with a ring again from the military academy. This is Domingo Monterosa, the commanding officer of the Atlacatl Battalion, the first U.S. trained battalion in El Salvador. And another thing that's very interesting in this picture that I learned, soccer balls. It was a method that the Taiwanese military taught Guatemalan, Salvadoran, and other countries. The Taiwanese military said, look, give something back to the village. Give the kids soccer balls. This, I knew before I took this picture, that was what was in this picture. And he is the commanding officer of the Mazote massacre. He was very friendly to the media. I was on a first-name basis with him. I visited his garrison often because we had access to him, and access to the military was very important for the media. And the U.S. promoted this fellow. What you're also going to find out from this picture, that afternoon, I had already been with him for 2 days. I was with a reporter, John Lee Anderson. He got word that they had found the guerrilla Radio Venceremos transmitter and that he had to leave us. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we thought, oh, we're shot. We're losing our main character here. Could we come with him? He said, well, the helicopter's a little full. Could we drive out tomorrow to see you? He said, yes. Come again. It was about a 2-hour drive to the capital, maybe 3 hours. What happened the next day is that they found the transmitter in a cave. I'll show you where they found it. Huateca is where this picture is taken. So this is all pretty much guerrilla-controlled territory. Mozote is the massacre site. Huateca is where that picture was taken. He found it probably about 5 kilometers from here. Maybe some of you know what I'm going to tell you next. That transmitter was packed full of explosives. So when the helicopter took off with the transmitter inside and 14 Salvadoran soldiers and officers, it blew up. So they had lured him in here. They tricked him. Because of Mozote, the guerrilla group in charge, responsible for that geographic area, had him targeted, but they packed that transmitter, no bigger than the size of a stereo amplifier, full of explosives. And they watched the helicopter go up, boom. So this was the last picture of Domingo Monterosa. We knew the next day what had happened. John Lee and I were going to drive out to meet with him again. But we had heard that morning that he was no longer. So what I tried to do for editors is pack a frame full of content and context. Yes, I had to explain about why he was handing over a soccer ball. Whether that got into the story, I'm not sure. But these little things are important in educating and informing the public what is going on in a conflict. These small things are very important. But again, the ring. He's a graduate of the military academy in San Salvador, Santa Tecla. In March of 1982, 4 Dutch journalists set off from San Salvador to meet with the guerrillas 2 hours away in the mountains. They were staying in the same hotel that I was. The next day, they came back in caskets. They were killed. They were followed, their rooms were bugged, their phones were tapped, and they were very obviously seeking out a meeting with the guerrillas. When I came down the morning before this picture was taken, they were in the lobby, in the hotel, with their maps out. Remember, we used to use maps. It's an indication you're going somewhere. Now it's in the palm of your hand. But if you pulled maps out in a hotel, in San Salvador, in a conflict zone, you're not going to the beach. This, to me, was like, I'm staying away from this team. Why they did this, I have no idea. But it was an indication, and it was a hotel owned by the right wing. You said nothing in your room to your colleague or roommate. If you were going to speak about your plans, you waited till you were outside. You didn't know if there were microphones in the walls, but your phones were definitely tapped. And they had been following these 4. So when they got up to the location where they were supposed to meet the guerrillas, They were stopped by the military, taken up into the forest, and killed. The significance of this, twofold. One, we're targets. And two, this case is now alive in Amsterdam through lawyers supported by one of the brothers of these four human rights attorneys. They have found the Salvadoran officer who was the perpetrator of this killing. He's been living in Virginia in the United States. He's 80 years old, and papers were filed last month to perhaps send him back to San Salvador, kick him out because he lied on his visa form. He had not committed any crimes against humanity. He had not committed any felonies, but he lied. So the families have not forgotten, obviously, but the case is alive. And from Copenhagen, I will go to Amsterdam and I will meet the family of Jan Kuiper. I don't know. And the idea of showing dead bodies, I think, Finn, you may have some ideas about how bodies are shown, but I had to hide the head. It's out of politeness, dignity. The head was beaten up, but by the nature of this room, I didn't have much room to work in, but it turned out that I blocked the head. And this, in the United States, is a presentable picture. We'll go back to this morgue picture. Americans have no stomach for dead bodies or brutality. So you had to minimize to make it presentable. But the case is alive. Early in the morning of one day in 1983, we had heard that this government militia outpost had been attacked. So with another colleague from Newsweek magazine, we got there at about 6:15, 6:30 in the morning. And this had been a bunker in the corner of a rural village that was attacked by the guerrillas the night before. You'll notice that all the weapons are gone. And this was the point of impact of an RPG rocket. These are the townspeople coming to look. Nothing had been moved. And the idea was for us to get there early enough before anything is moved, because after the military comes back, and this is a guerrilla, they flee and the military comes back in, usually around 8 o'clock. Now, 50 feet away was this family. In a doorway, this woman has just been told that one of the 3 people here is her brother. So she faints. And again, the idea of being there quickly with a camera. I don't know if you've seen people who've fainted, but the expression, the eyes half open, still conscious, but literally fainted. Everyone here is related. If you look closely at the faces, father, mother, daughter, probably older sister, niece, nephew. That's a small village. But again, quickly arriving at a place for me was imperative, and to get the film out of the country. Evidence of the United States, their muscle, how they threw their presence around, is in a military airport in downtown San Salvador, Ilopango Air Base. You can see this plane here arriving with a dignitary, probably a diplomat, and the ever-present Cadillac, which has been replaced now by a black Suburban. This is a 10,000-pound, 5-ton armored Cadillac. They just barged right through the airport. They were expected, of course. But this, to me, represented a few things. One, go to these ceremonies. You never know what you're going to find. Hopefully something like this, an iconic message. Not only the plane that says the United States of America on it, but the Cadillac, followed by a security car. This was also the air base that the CIA used to supply the Contras in Nicaragua that were fighting the Sandinistas. Ilopango Air Base was where weapons and materiel would be flown to Honduras or airdropped in the mountains of Nicaragua. So it was an opportunity for us to get into a military base. We had permission. But the Cadillac, for me, it's the equivalent of a black Suburban. Why the United States continues to use vehicles like this, which are clearly identifiable, and a target, I don't know. But again, being a resident photographer in a conflict zone gives you a lot of opportunities to find these subtle, these nuanced images. Not so nuanced to me, but perhaps to a reader. Now, one of the dignitaries that came down was Jean Kirkpatrick. She is a right-wing ideologue. At the moment in this picture, she is the United States representative to the United Nations, but she's also part of the Reagan National Security Council and a severe anti-communist. This is Dean Hinton, the U.S. ambassador to San Salvador, a Graham Greene character in a white linen suit, also an amazing poker player, spoke like a cowboy, from Montana, smoked big cigars, and was a fabulous poker player. She has come down to reprimand him. I want more dead communists. I found this out about 10 years ago from the public affairs officer who was present at that time. She basically fired him on this trip. Where do they send him? To Pakistan to run the jihad against the Soviet army. So he was on his third wife, a Salvadoran woman, and she thought he was getting soft. We want more dead bodies. The only Salvadoran in this picture is the foreign minister here, Chavez Mena. You can see the way the Americans take over. This is the Salvadoran foreign ministry. Now, Americans weren't the only ones who walked around like this, but I had an opportunity to take this picture and did. Another person that would show up is Henry Kissinger. This is a congressional delegation with a senator, a congressman, and the head of the American affiliated labor unions, AFL-CIO. Coming down, this is the Salvadoran president, Alvaro Magana. This is the presidential palace. He's made a stop in Honduras already to tell the Salvadorans, please improve your human rights record and there'll be more aid coming. Every 6 months, military aid had to be approved in Congress. If they showed improvement, the military aid would be voted through. And it was usually opposed by the Democrats, left-wing congressmen and senators, but it inevitably got through. And when you send Henry Kissinger to a country, it's pretty serious. He was, again, part of the Vietnam War and the Cold War era. It was my responsibility to make sure I was present if somebody like that came to the country. This is a former football player, Jack Kemp. Jim Wright, a well-known congressman at the time, and a labor leader in the presidential palace. Something, again, by going to ceremonies at a military academy graduation, you got this very bizarre scenery. Something not Salvadoran, but colorful. Early in the morning, 3 or 4 times a week, women would show up at the Salvadoran Human Rights Commission to express to the head of it who was missing from their family. Now look closely. You could write a story as a reporter just looking at the details, the shoes, the dress, going to an office, going back to the house, wearing the apron, freshly washed hair, which in Latin America you didn't do unless you were in a hurry because she showed up with wet hair. This is these nuances that you pick up. It was important for her to come and register. Nothing was ever done. Nothing. But you had to register it. And you can see this confessional face receiving. She has her number, tag, register. But look at the dresses, the shoes, polished shoes, sandals. Gives you an indication of the income group and the type of person that, having gone to market or about to, but definitely going to an office. These are guerrillas from a unit out in the eastern part of the country. It's also the cover of the book. And look at their eyes. He's asking information, but this is the intensity of a Civil War face. I didn't notice this notebook when I had scanned the image for a couple of years because it's kind of buried in here, camouflaged. Now, a notebook indicates that the man is literate. Again, as a reporter, as a good observer, you could write a story from this picture. You can see the poverty of a village, no clothing, gathering information, the intensity, and the Che Guevara look. Still surprises me. And his eyes. One of the parts of counterinsurgency that was a holdover from Vietnam, this is a battalion trained by the Americans, spread out. What are they doing so close together? Because if a machine gun were in these bushes, they'd all be dead. So the training methods, did they work? I can leave that to you. Everything here is supplied by the United States. Backpacks, rifles, M16s, canteen, caps, and a method of crossing a river that I wanted to have nothing to do with. I stopped. I didn't cross. These are the mountains that are controlled by the guerrillas. They usually left big battalions alone. Any given morning, you could go up this deserted road about 45 minutes from San Salvador and find something in unoccupied territory. The farmers had all left. This truck had been ambushed the night before with Salvadoran army soldiers. The group that attacked this Ford pickup truck already stripped them of uniforms, in particular boots and weapons. This group had just come from another village where they were buying food supplies to take up to this volcano where they controlled the territory. I would get there at 6 o'clock, 6:30, 7 in the morning. This is what you could find. There's another body. But no boots. Here's another one. 1, 2, 3, 4. And there were 3 or 4 more off to the right. They didn't need to steal the truck. They wanted the boots, the uniforms, and the weapons. Again, all supplied by the United States. These shirts had come from some army unit. And you can see the different boots, store-bought shoes, details that we had to recognize quickly. So you could tell the reporter what you saw when you got back to the capital. That was 19 pictures. That's the end. And I'd like to hear your questions And I think Finn would like to say a few words also, I believe. We'll have a discussion. Right. I won't let you linger on that picture. We'll go to the beach.
Okay. Thank you, Robert.
You're welcome.
First of all, thanks for your visit, for your presentation, and for your fantastic book.
Again?
Yeah? Okay, that's better. It's just because there was a light on. Sorry. Yeah, okay. We can have enough thanks. So thanks for your visit, your talk, and your fantastic book. We have a small but dedicated and very knowledgeable audience, so I'm sure they have a lot of questions, so I'll be fairly brief. Just a few brief comments and a couple of questions. I mean, when we see your material, we understand why you couldn't resist the temptation to put together a book. I mean, it's fantastic material. You have photos of soldiers, fighters, weapon, the slain, important figures, some of the bad guys. One would say a very masculine gaze in a conventional sense. But you have also many photos of the everyday life, of the everyday celebrations, the hard work in the field, food for work programs, weddings, religious processions. Life goes on somehow, and it's often the image you get of wars in Europe or the States, for example, is that, oh, it's war all over, but you catch a lot of the everyday as well. And it includes these photos from the graduation ceremony at the officer school in San Salvador, and I think that actually made a lot of impact on me. Seeing these young, it was not there, but these young cadets, often lower middle class men, whose families see an opportunity for social ascendance in making an army career. My question is, what guided your gaze? What caught your attention in your work? I mean, a bit like doing ethnographic field work, you have to make decisions everywhere of who to follow, where to go, where are the chances of something happening that you might be interested in. So, I mean, how did you make decisions about this every day, where to go and look for photo opportunities and so on? But what kind of guided your gaze?
It's a good question. You needed some kind of plan. I worked for a weekly publication. We would propose a story on a Saturday. By Saturday evening or Sunday morning, we got a green light or a red light about whether a proposal would be accepted for the following week that we had 3 to 4 days to report on. The reporter had to start sending in his report by Wednesday. Thursday pretty much was finished. Friday, the playback would come, meaning the story about to be finished and finalized before it was printed. So I had to have pictures that reflected the words. This was a word-driven publication, not a visual-driven publication. I was lucky if I got 1 or 2 pictures in a week. So it was a lot of effort, a lot of running around following any number of things related to the article, but also looking towards an article for 2 weeks, 3 weeks away that I knew would eventually be coming up. We live in a narrative storytelling world, even back in pre-digital. It's a narrative world. And I had a view of, 1, working on the article that was given, 2, but also guiding the editor, my picture editor, and how to educate them to provoke a discussion for the public, to provide enough content and context to an editor that was also covering something in Indonesia or in China, not just Latin America, where you got to know who their leaders were, when the elections were happening, what the holidays were, when Mardi Gras was in Brazil. That was easy for them, but these small nuances, the details of daily life during a conflict, were essential. And I wasn't there as an adrenaline junkie, but certainly I had to understand conflict. But daily life was also difficult and a challenge to cover, and that is what I went out to do, is to follow daily life. With the morgue.
Yeah.
Again, you go to the beach, you go to the morgue.
Life goes on, and
Life
death goes on. I mean, your images they're very impactful, and they recall a lot of memories for like our generation. But I mean, for which Central America also had a different presence than today. So one of my questions would be, what about today, 40 years later? What impact do you and your publisher expect from these photos, from this book, for like new generations?
The whole confusion about immigration and migration, the political ramifications and the sociological, anthropological ramifications of disruption, this was the period of time that started the migration north from Latin America. The violence from this civil war towards the Mexican people fled. And I saw in this film that sat in a box, unedited, for 15 years, maybe longer. It sat in my hallway when my wife finally said, "Would you please move that box where the notebooks were? Do something with them." She did not want to be an archive widow, is what she called it. Organize this. So I did, and I saw my own way of covering this war for 4 years. I determined the sequencing, I determined what the main pictures were, and it was a way to reinterpret that period of time and reflect upon what was happening today. Because the conflict, the immigration issues that are happening on the U.S.-Mexican border are significant. And for many years, it was due to violence that people fled north. Now it's climate, it's economic. There are other reasons for it. But this was the period of time that people fled violence, yet the United States supported the regime that perpetrated the violence. And I felt I had a responsibility to do something with that box, yes. But what I found was very interesting to me to relive and reinterpret that period of time.
But what do you expect? What kind of impact in new generations?
It will provoke a discussion. It's not just climate or economic influences that cause migration, but the violence from that period of time, post-Vietnam War, for me, post-Cold War, were important landmarks and foundational periods of time that people should remember and take stock of.
Okay. I have a few questions on war. I mean, I'm not very knowledgeable about war photography and stuff like that, but I have a few questions on proximity and visibility. So, I mean, there's been some research pointing to the differences between, for example, BBC and Al Jazeera in depictions of war, where BBC would be like typically more distanced, while Al Jazeera gave more close-up and intimate depictions. These are kind of way back research. But this coincides with the kind of traditional stereotypical image of northern versus southern newspapers. For example, Guatemalan newspapers would be described as the kind of newspapers where if you tilt them a bit, there will be blood coming out. So lots of pages of dead bodies from drug-related violence, traffic accidents, for example. Meanwhile, in some Western media, there seemed to be a different ethical codex at play, where the media stays away from showing various kinds of graphic content, and they pride themselves of this. Now, your photos are not distant. Many of them are close range, very intimate. Many faces and eyes are looking into the lens. Many dead bodies, mourning relatives, or others dealing with the dead bodies, have found their way into your book. To quote Alma Guillermo Prieto, who's written a few pages in your book, she says, there's a nakedness about Nickelsberg's images, an unvarnished quality that speaks of their essential truthfulness. So this is about visibility and proximity, but it's more than just about dead bodies being visible or not. I mean, some dead bodies are supposed to be visible to some audiences, like the ones tossed at the roadside in poor neighborhoods in San Salvador, where the subversion was supposed to be present and have support. It's a very crude pedagogy in a sense. Other dead bodies are supposed to be hidden and kept out of the public eye, like dead US soldiers returning from Afghanistan, COVID-19 victims in India during the second wave, or the victims of massacres buried in clandestine mass graves. So there's a politics to dead bodies and an economy. So I was wondering you broached the theme a bit, but what are your reflections about these issues of proximity and visibility? What is the role you see for yourself in these politics of dead bodies? I mean, you may also want to talk about the investments that went into the proximity in terms of building relations with people, high as low, the government side and the other, also being exposed to the stench and the horror of the dead bodies. But how do you see a role in these politics about visibility of dead bodies or not?
At that time, I worked with 2 cameras in color and 1 in black and white. So I had 3 cameras on myself at all times. Color of a dead body is one thing. Black and white of a dead body is another. The blood is not red in black and white. And it's not going to upset my editor, who will then have to show it to her editors. And this is not a tabloid publication with a traffic death or a bullfight or a cartel death, which is normally in color and on the front page of, say, a Tijuana, Mexico publication. Americans have no tolerance for that type of descriptive image. So I had to not necessarily tone it down or censor, but just move the square differently. And that morgue picture is an indication of how I minimized the most brutal of the 2. Minimize that, but don't erase it. And try to focus on the victims. Not the dead person, but the families. And what the impact is. That is what I wanted to see as a element of discussion, to provoke a discussion about the death of perhaps innocent civilians. And how do you do that and not have a uniform in there or a rifle from a military situation? The number of dead bodies on a daily basis could be 25, could be 30, could be 6, but that was a daily basis. We tried to get to as many as possible before the funeral parlors gathered them, because that was business. And that removed the evidence. And what we were there to do is provide a counter-narrative to the government's claim in Washington that things were improving. I don't think so, was my position. And I represented field work. The reporter I worked with did the text. He didn't need to go to the field. He had to talk to the experts within the Capitol. And they were very willing to talk to him, anonymously, some. But my pictures were not anonymous. Although the dead were often anonymous, I wanted to put an identity to them. This was the impact that I felt personally, and I took it personally. The best way to be inspired is through anger and clarity. That's what motivated me. It didn't make me happy to see a pile of dead bodies. And literally, I came across a pickup truck full of dead bodies being taken to the Capitol on a back road. Literally, full. How do you describe on film a graphic situation like this? You have to move around so it's acceptable. But the impact is important, not just the number. But these were situations which we came across very often, and I had to make it provocative but acceptable at the same time.
Do you have any idea if any of your photos or the reports had any impact on, say, at government level, of the decisions being made?
They saw them. If I went to the Time Archive, which collected my pictures that particularly ran in the magazine or that were selected for a weekly edit, I mean, I own the pictures. I got all those pictures back from the archive. But I could sit down. The archivist would come out with a tray of my images for 3 months. I'd sit down and go through them. I mostly didn't recognize them because so many had gone by. But I could also see who took them out, who came into the Time Archive, U.S. State Department. Now, they weren't doing research for a thesis. They wanted to see what we were collecting. And I could see their initials and where they came from. So I knew there was an impact. How we were the counter-narrative. That's about as good as it could get. On a daily basis. I worked every single day that I was there. Or I went to the beach and the morgue.
I was wondering, because the guerrilla movement sure would have this kind of interest as well in that kind of photos. And I noted one of the difference between the Guatemalan situation and Salvadoran was that the Salvadoran war was much more in the media in the States than the Guatemalan war. That was much more, for many reasons, it was much more a national.
It's almost impossible to cover the Guatemalan.
And also the guerrilla organizations, the Salvadoran had, like, at this time, maybe 200 people working on media relations. Correct. And political external relations, while the Guatemalans had maybe 2. Like, anyway, I think I'll leave it here and invite questions for our wonderful audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Finn.
Thank you so much for getting the conversation started, Finn. Thank you for your questions. So we're going to open up for your questions, and we're using a mic so that people following this conversation on live stream can also hear you. So Emilia will pass the mic around to whoever would like to start. Great, we have already 2 questions in the back.
Yeah, thanks. My name is George from the University of Copenhagen. Thanks so much for your talk and the pictures. What really strikes me is that you took the pictures and then you had to send them off. And even though I should have learned that from a movie, I'm not sure if you like it or not, Under Fire, which ends the kid taking the film to the airport, right? But I forgot that. So I understand how important that must have been for you to publish the book and do your own selection. So I'm wondering if you had any chance to assess the selection done and published. So the pictures which you think you are, in your opinion, are really precious. Do you recognize them? Have they been published? What's the bias in the publishing? You touched on that briefly, but maybe you could explore that a little bit more. Thanks so much.
Thank you, George. Do you mean the color pictures that were published? or, well, at, so it's a relevant point. At the time, 1982, the magazines, all magazines, Europe or US, wherever, were moving to full color. And that was driven by the advertisers. They wanted color. So my black and white became less relevant to the editor because they could convert color to black and white. If it was a black and white page, for instance. But I continued to take black and white because I had more flexibility in low or bad light. Yeah, I knew from the darkroom it's really hard to work around water and at 12 o'clock sun, for instance, technically speaking. But I knew I could shoot it in such a way that it would be processed and it would come out. Whereas color had to be precise. Quarter stop off, out. So I had different parameters to work in. I had more flexibility in black and white. I could go into more rooms, interiors, for instance, in low light. So these pictures that I hadn't seen, let's see, 1984 is when I left El Salvador. I didn't see these pictures till like 2006. I lived overseas. Why carry? I mean, in India, where I was for 11 years, the climate control was insane. It would have ruined everything. So I had them at a photo agency for 2 years, the black and whites, because you had to get them out of Time magazine. They had to go somewhere. So the photo agency then tried to resell them. He didn't. And in 2005, I got a call from him. I'm closing the agency. Please come and get them. So I went, this is in Brooklyn, New York, picked up the box, and then I put them in the hallway, where they stayed until I had the wicked finger, do something with these pictures, please. And I said, gladly. So I got an intern, and we went through them and organized everything. But the color I was sick of, because I had seen them forever. And these were perfectly exposed, perfectly cropped images that I knew. These were unknown to me. With different, this is a Rolly, a 2 1/4 square. I couldn't shoot that for the magazine. I carried 4 cameras sometimes. This was the 4th. But so I reveled in these. These were really, in my mind, heroic images that should have been published back then. They have more meaning for me. There's more content. And the people are really who I cared about, the local civilians. And in a way, this is an honor to them as much as it is to my ability to shoot 3 cameras. Big deal. I could shoot 5 if I had to. But my back suffered, not just my head. But all of these pictures required great physical effort to keep up with these people. I mean, to sit in a car at 40 degrees centigrade in summer and then drive back at the end of the day, go to the airport and ship your film. I mean, I was physically exhausted, mentally shot at the end of every day. And these images continue to resonate with me. And I still think they're important for young students to see what you could do in a conflict zone. Now, it's incredibly more difficult today to function as a journalist in a conflict zone. It's almost impossible. And I worked with Islamic fundamentalism in Kabul, Pakistan, in Hindu-Muslim riots in India. This is nothing compared to the rubbish I had to confront on a regular basis. So I learned how to cover conflict here. And I had to know weapons. You have to know what this rifle is, where it comes from. Finn mentioned Guatemala. My God, that place was so sinister and so mysterious at the same time that I was covering this conflict. You can't believe how nasty that place was. Still is, Guatemala. And I had a U.S. Embassy official confront me at the embassy when the bureau chief of Time magazine came in from Mexico City, and I went in with 2 big suitcases full of lights and stands and reflectors and umbrellas to interview the U.S. ambassador. We had jackets on. I mean, this is no blue jeans, no sneakers. This was a formal interview. And the public affairs officer, I couldn't believe this, had the nerve to ask me, why is Time magazine here interviewing the U.S. ambassador? Why? It had been accepted already through the State Department. But the ignorance of that fellow to ask me, and I had already been with the guerrillas clandestinely. We had attacked the U.S. Embassy at night. We blew up power stations. We went on assassination trips. He had no idea that it was me. But to reveal to a journalist the incredulity of why I'm there just works the opposite. It just increased my interest in the country. You're crazy. So in this context, I haven't forgotten about that. And I also can relate it to 2021 when the U.S. withdrew from Kabul and left everybody high and dry. And I covered that country for over 30 years. So I know about U.S. policy and how to illustrate it. That was my responsibility that I gave myself when I went to Central America, was to illustrate foreign policy. And that's a big responsibility. It may be too high for one person, but we should take another question.
Someone else?
You've already answered my question, because I wanted to ask you if it was an advantage for you as a U.S. citizen to work in a conflict which was, as you already told us, was a U.S. involvement. But do you think that compared to other photographers from other parts of the world, that you had an advantage being a U.S. citizen?
It's a disadvantage too. I often had to say I was Canadian or Costa Rican. Something. How many seconds do I need to get to that door because I'm an American? 3. You had to be aware of this, and it's a responsibility. I learned how to deal with it. When I went to Pakistan from New Delhi, I would go to a dinner in Lahore, for instance, right across the border, and I would be asked, so, where are you from? I live in New Delhi. And they would say, you're from the enemy, because the Indians and the Pakistanis hate each other. No, I'm not from the enemy. But it wasn't me and individually, it was the government that they disliked. It wasn't you as the journalist. Yes, they could attack me, but it didn't often happen. I also knew where the door was, or the window, just in case. I mean, if an Argentine goes to Britain during the Falkland Malvinas War, what are they going to do, you know? So the responsibilities, and there's also pleasure in humor, being able to de-ice the situation. That's a good question.
Do we have other questions? Because otherwise I'd follow up on that, but we do, so I'll...
Okay, I guess I spent time in a wind turbine conflict area a a few years ago, and I think there's a similarity to your pictures. I mean, that this is an outright conflict, right? But the way you portray kind of the signals of war and violence, this kind of that you notice all these details, the rings, that a normal reader wouldn't necessarily read, I think is quite a big part of how violence represents itself in these conflict zones. Like where I went, there was a lot of how people wore their bags. You could see if there's a gun inside or not a gun inside. There are shrines on the side of roads that remind you kind of death. And I guess I want to ask if you see kind of a difference in this kind of more latent conflict zones and these images, or if you see it as the same kind of thing, the importance of actually noticing these smaller signs, the subtlety of war and violence, I guess. I don't know, does it make sense?
I would get out of the car in this situation with my cameras around my neck to sort of introduce who I was. Not get out of the car immediately not a good idea. So gain the trust or familiarity of the people, and they can see right away that you're not a farmer from that area, that you're foreign, and that you're media. That was important to identify yourself. Now, in these environmental situations, you have to be able to read the situation very quickly and know where you are. I mean, in a wind turbine conflict area, there might be signs, no wind here, and there'd be a cross through a wind tower. So you knew you were getting into enemy territory, so-called enemy. And ask the appropriate question. Have you been approached by the salespeople from the utilities, rather than saying, can I take a picture of your wind tower? So go around. Again, the counter narrative is very important to know this in order to cool the situation down and gain people's trust for a moment. But I also learned how to park my car to make sure I had the car pointed in the right direction to get out of there if I had to. So you have to understand all of these elements simultaneously. And you still might be attacked or criticized or yelled at, but sort of deconflict the situation in a conflict zone if you can. And not everybody knows how to do that, and it's very often why I traveled by myself. Every 3 years I had a new reporter. Every 3 years I had to educate. And in a conflict zone, to educate somebody, you're on your own. I mean, not to be so cold and harsh, but I have a job to do, and it's not written in my contract that I have to educate the reporter. Journalism is a collaboration, and the best journalism, you collaborate with another person. But environmental conflicts are difficult, and you have to know what you're looking at.
We have more questions, but not a lot of time, so we'll take 2 questions, and then you can should we do that? Take the 2 questions together, and then you can respond.
Thank you so much for coming here and showing us these pictures. My name is Julie. I work mostly on Nicaragua, but I've been in El Salvador twice in the last couple of years. And I was there for the parliamentary elections in 2021, which was quite an eye-opener for me in terms of what's happening politically in El Salvador now, where Bukele has led this crackdown on gang violence by installing a very repressive security policy. And also what is sort of a strategy of Bukele is to wage a war on the past, basically, by saying that everything that came before him was just these two corrupt sides fighting each other and making Salvadorans fight a war that had nothing to do with them, and presenting himself, as this third way or a savior out of all of that. But actually, in many ways, neglecting, I think, along with others, the actual struggles of the people and the victims in El Salvador, and also preventing them from reaching justice. And I think what your pictures show is really all these emotions and the pain of people during that conflict. And the victims. So I wanted to ask you how you feel about the current stance of the El Salvadoran government towards the civil war and calling the peace agreements nothing but a farce. That I understand the post-war El Salvador was very complicated in many ways, but yeah, I would say today is also an authoritarian situation.
Oh, sure.
Who was the second person? Was it you, Mike?
I was going to ask something rather similar, but I also have a number of other questions which I'd like to illustrate very briefly with the recent experience in Denmark associated with this institution, but also associated with the Danish media, who have retold the story of the Danish involvement in the Afghanistan intervention, particularly by a very high-profile TV series, which has been aired recently, which has revealed the stories of people in both in the Danish military and in the conflicts in the Balkans, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan over a period of about 30 years, and has, interestingly enough, I think, sort of reframed the debate in Denmark about those kind of foreign interventions. People didn't really talk very much about it. It was kind of disappeared off the screen after 2021 in Kabul. But then this program has sort of developed the discussion again and reopened the discussion around. So it's been a very effective use of TV media to open a debate. And what I wonder about in relation to your pictures and the stories that are told in the US, how do you in the modern era with digital communication and very high speed and social media and so on, how do you reframe the discussion about all these foreign interventions? How do you make a foreign policy impact? And obviously, from the US position, the situation in the Middle East is the most critical. How do you do something in which you project an honest message? You're the one who talked about the lies, in another way which opens a debate. I'm very curious about that, and my interest has been provoked by the experience of this TV show in Denmark about Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Balkans.
That's a complicated question. One being I'm not familiar with the TV series, but I certainly saw the Danish military in Afghanistan. I saw them there. I'm not aware of any issues that may have come to the surface following that. But regarding foreign policy, remember there's a public position that you're able to read about, and there's the private diplomacy that is off the record, and that's where the real discussion is, off the record. And the reason I can say that is I attended a lot of the off-the-record briefings with the reporter in El Salvador, and in Guatemala and in Kabul and in India, where no cameras, but I'm allowed in because I want to be informed. I take a better picture that way. It also is a way to survive in a conflict, is to know what they're doing. And I worked in Kashmir a lot. So there's a public position where information can be debated and discussed openly and researched, but it's in the private realm where the real meat is, and what you're not familiar with, how they're going to present their position, their policy position publicly. And that's for consumption and also perception. And communications involves that. How to limit a discussion, given the amount of information that is out there, it's tricky and requires, to train a good diplomat is no different than a pilot. 10 years to train a diplomat. And I worry in the United States where diplomats move every 2 years, 3 years. How do you become an expert in a place? By the time you arrive, you settle, and then you're ready to leave again. So you need expertise, and why institutions like this are so important. But to understand Bukele, the United States is happy with Bukele because migration has slowed down. And their numbers, that's what they're counting. They don't care how he got there. Yes, they do, but they can deflect that. It's numbers. And I covered the Salvadoran gangs in LA, MS-13. These were 2, 3-year-olds when they came north and crossed in Texas into California who became gang members. I covered them with the LAPD. And I wore a flak jacket in LA to go out. Of course, I knew how to wear a flak jacket. But in my own country, I'm wearing a flak jacket. And these are gang members from Salvador. They were kids, like in these pictures, who came north. So I don't know what really the response is for Bukele. The word is still out, but we were talking before that you build a prison to hold 40,000 prisoners. That's a football stadium. How many of those do you have to build? But the civilians are happy that they can go out at night. They can go visit relatives in another part of the city. What's the compromise here? There's a compromise. But it's a pursuit of peace, supposedly. To understand peace, you need to know why countries go to war. And this is part of the lesson. Visualize it, explain it, provoke a discussion. This is a country that has very little perception about heroic history. They have no understanding. There were no shared values in El Salvador between the different levels of income. There was no closure also, no closure. It's still going on. And in Guatemala, with the indigenous, that's still going on. There's no closure. So how do you have good diplomacy without closure? What's the final goal of a diplomat? What's the final goal of foreign policy? Is peace and well-being, perhaps. But things are very temporary right now. And I knew when an American flag was burned in Old Delhi in the first Gulf War, 1991. I don't know if any of you have been to Delhi, but the old section is Muslim. And when an American flag was burned, wait a minute, they anti-American? No, they're not. Who's supporting this? The flag burning. There has to be rupees going around to get a crowd. You rent a crowd. I'm not being cynical here. I'm being factual. somebody is supporting that group to burn the American flag. Now, the Libyans, the Iraqis, and the Iranians were involved in Old Delhi. There are all these different layers. It's three-dimensional chess out there. And it's a complicated response to your question. Really. It requires a meal, more meals, more discussions, more beer. You have to get down into the layers of it to where we're all on the same page, and that requires a good diplomat.
So I will interrupt. I hope you will, well, you're definitely very welcome to stick around for a little while, have more coffee, talk to Robert. And I'm just going to take the liberty, now that I have the mic, as a comment to Julie's comment about the current government and how they might, I wonder what this book would spark of conversation if you were to present it. But as you mentioned that right now there is some optimism in the population because of the current security situation that has improved. But I wonder if he has been looking to Brazil because when they try to make the country more secure from crime by putting all the prisoners, putting everyone in prison, that's exactly when the gangs that are ruling the country today were formed. That was inside the prison, and today they run the conflicts and the organized crime from within the prisons. So putting all these people together in a prison can also, in the long run, create a very different and unwanted situation. So I wonder if we have, what kind of peace and for how long it will last. But I guess that is for us to follow. There's so much for us to follow and catch up on. But thank you so much for coming, Robert, and for, well, at least enlightening us on this issue. Thank you all for coming and joining the conversation.
There are 2 books available for sale if you'd like